Today, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to nonverbal communication. Research indicates that somewhere between 70 and 93% of our communication is nonverbal. And that may be surprising to you. It is to most people, but I think you'll see as we go through this brief unit that it is true. So, nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication can either stand alone or it can accompany speech. So when we talk about how we use nonverbal messages, we use them to accent or emphasize. It's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. So if your mother says, clean your room, that's very different than clean your room, right? So we emphasize different things. It can complement or add nuance to a particular statement. It can contradict. When our verbal and nonverbal messages are incongruent, people tend to believe the nonverbal because we think that it's harder for people to make their bodies lie. We use nonverbal messages to regulate speech, to restate things, and to substitute. So if you look at the 5 body movements in this graphic, you can see that we have some explanations. Emblems are signals that we give nonverbally that translate directly into phrases. So we might say, okay, or come here, or hello, or go away. We might give the middle finger. Those are examples of emblems. Illustrators accompany and literally illustrate verbal messages. So like, for example, if you're giving directions to someone and you point, or perhaps you're talking about some concept that is circular, and so you turn your hand in a circle as you're talking. Affect displays, affect means emotion, so affect displays communicate emotional meaning. So we use largely our faces, but we can use other parts of our bodies to express things like happiness, surprise, fear, anger, sadness, disgust, and contempt. Regulators we use to control or regulate a conversation. So we might hold up our hand to say keep going or slow down. We use these to set the pace and indicate when we might want to speak and when we want to listen in a particular conversation. And adapters are things that we do. Self-touch would be one of those. We might scratch our head when we're thinking. We might look off to a particular direction when we're trying to remember something. Or we might rub our leg or tap our foot, things that we're often not aware of. So when we talk about nonverbal channels, we're talking about appearance, facial expressions, body movements, eye messages, artifacts, paralanguage, silence, time, smell, touch, proxemics, which is referring to how close or far apart objects or people are. So I want to go through these just briefly so to give you an idea. When we talk about appearance, we're looking at race, height, weight, attractiveness, and we make a lot of judgment calls on people just by the first impressions that we get on their appearance. Facial displays are expressions that we make with our face, and as I think you will see, some of these are universal and some of them are not. Eye messages. We all know what this is, what you do with your eyes, how long the gaze is. And some people may not have a healthy idea of how long a gaze should be, and so they stare. We've all been in places in public where we are looking at someone because we find them attractive, and suddenly they look at us and we look away because we don't want to be found out. We don't want to be embarrassed. We communicate very much through our eyes. You might wonder why restaurants turn the lights down low. That is because when you are in a dark environment, your pupils dilate. And so when restaurants turn down the lights, your eyes dilate, giving each other the impression that you are having a good time, even though you may not be. Eye contact is a very important issue in culture because some cultures are taught to look each other in the eye, and other cultures are taught that it's a sign of disrespect to look one in the eye, especially if one has higher power status. Body movements, we can see that different gestures have different meanings in different cultures. And so, for example, showing the bottom of your foot or your shoe in many cultures is considered an insult. You may remember When George Bush was in a press conference in Iraq many years ago, somebody threw a shoe at him. So the meaning of that was not only that they threw something at him, but that they threw a shoe, which was the ultimate flipping someone off kind of thing. So as we navigate different cultures, we have to be aware that not all expressions, body movements are taken the same way. So we have to be aware that as we navigate different cultures, that our body movements and our hand gestures may not be received the same way that we intend them. Proxemics has to do with how close or far away people are, how people sit, how close they are. It's fascinating. So I've noticed as I travel that in the United States, if there's 3 seats on an airplane and there's 2 men, they will sit on the aisle and the window with an empty seat between them, whereas in many parts of the world that I've visited, 2 men have no problem sitting next to each other. We have Western phobias about being perceived as gay when one is not. So it's interesting how it affects behavior. You can tell a lot about people's depth of their relationship as well by how close they are together. Many of these things are both cultural and a sign of relationship and personality. Artifacts, you can tell much about a person by artifacts, and I like to think of artifacts as those things that are left behind if you were to leave. So how you decorate your house, what kind of car you drive, what kind of jewelry you wear, your tattoos, your clothing, all of those things are artifacts, and they all communicate different aspects of one. And of course, many of these can be extremely cultural. Gift giving is a very interesting concept. I once had a student from Ghana who lived in Canada, and when he returned home, he went to visit folks, and he found that they were staying very long and not leaving. And then someone reminded him that until he gave a gift to the people that were there, that they were going to hang around. And so once he remembered that, he got his gifts out, gave them to the people, and they left promptly. Food is another one that is very cultural. And that same student from Ghana was living in Canada, and he was taken out for lunch and ordered a Big Mac. Well, in Ghana, bread is generally only served for breakfast or as a snack. And so when he ate a Big Mac, his mind told him that he was still hungry, because in his frame of reference, bread is not a meal. And so his mind was more engaged than his stomach to tell him that he was still hungry, because you just don't eat bread for a meal. So it's interesting how these cultural constructs can affect how we view things. Paralanguage has to do with all the ways that we communicate verbally or vocally, we might say. So pitch, volume, rate, noises, all those kinds of things. So music would fall into this category. And we find that paralanguage is very different as we cross cultures. Silence is another channel, and we find that different cultures have different amount of emphasis on silence. So silence is very valued in some cultures, and in other cultures, they are uncomfortable with silence. So in the West, people tend to not be comfortable with silence, and so they fill up space with words, whereas this can seem very disrespectful in more silence-valued cultures. Time, as you may know, is perceived in different ways in different places. So is time fixed or is it relative? Is there an emphasis on being together or in following the clock? So you'll find in some cultures that it doesn't matter when you start and stop. The emphasis is on the fact that you are together. And so that's okay. And so meetings or events can go on for a very long time. Is the culture oriented to the past, the present, or the future? Also related to time, how long does it take to make a decision? Just like in different personalities, some people need more time to process something. And I found that this is very much active in cultural contexts. So this is a picture of my friend Maluk. He's from West Africa. the country of Ivory Coast, and I was together with him several years ago, and I was teaching for 3 weeks in a video production school that he was running. So we would discuss during an evening, okay, Deb, what are you going to do tomorrow? And so we would talk about it. Sometimes we'd talk about it for an hour or something. And I would go to bed thinking that we had made a decision about what was going to happen the next day. And the next morning he would say, so Deb, what are we going to do today? So we had a very different sense of when a decision was made and the time that it took to make those. I've been to Greece several times, and I spent 5 months there living on an island because I was with a hospital ship. And so I was ship photographer. So I needed to go into Athens frequently to buy film, to get film processed. This was in those old days, when we shot negative film and had to get it processed. And so there was a ship launch in this little shipyard where we were, and I would go the day before and say, okay, tomorrow, what time is the ship launch going that would take us to Athens? And they might give me a time of like 9 o'clock. And so the next day I would show up at 9 o'clock. And sometimes the response I got was, oh, they've already left, or, well, we're not going to go today. And so when will the boat leave? When is something going to happen? Those can be very situational in other cultures. So we have to exert a certain amount of flexibility instead of getting upset all the time. Smell is very powerful. It is one of the most powerful senses that we have. And as you know, smell can trigger lots of different emotions. And why do people light scented candles or bake cookies or an apple pie when they're trying to sell their house? Because when people come to see the house, they walk in and they get reminded of things like, oh, it's like cookies grandma used to make. And so it conjures up these positive emotions and is supposed to help with actually making a transaction. In some cultures, it is perfectly acceptable to show a lot of affection in public, and in other cultures, it is not. Of course, in the Muslim world, men are not allowed to touch women that they are not related to. In some parts of the world, it's very common for same-sex people to hold hands, but it would be very taboo for opposite-sex people to show any kind of public displays of affection. Proxemics has to do with not only our distance between each other, but our space, our territory. And the idea of personal space is not even a concept in some cultures. And then you start thinking about the ways that we communicate non-verbally using space is quite powerful. So when you put a fence up, it says something, right? You put a door on your house. So I remember hearing a story years ago about missionaries that went into a village and none of the houses had doors on them. And one time when the missionaries were away from their house, someone came in and was curious and took apart their radio and then could not get it back together, and it infuriated the missionaries, and so they put a door on their house. And imagine what that communicated to the people they were working with at the time. So I hope this is an interesting unit for you, that this little presentation and the chapter will really kind of open your eyes to the different ways that we communicate nonverbally. So just a few principles we can learn. Don't assume all nonverbal communication is universal. Research culture before visiting. You will miss things. Remember, there are always culture and unique personal traits in every situation. And realize that people are usually forgiving when we offend them, but not always.